I pulled her out of that chair on a Tuesday morning, in front of Colonel Rask and 12 soldiers who had nothing better to do than watch. That was my mistake. Not the chair, not even the colonel. The mistake was the 12 soldiers. You do something like that in front of 12 people, and the 11 who stay silent and the one who laughs. They all remember it differently later. And none of them remember it the way you want. She'd been at observation post Keller for 7 months by then. Same position, same chair by the eastern aperture, the one with the long sight line down the valley to Route Breckman. 7 months. I'd been running that fire base for 4 of them, and I'd inherited her along with the water pressure problem and the generator that coughed at 0200 every other night. She was just there. Quiet. Her kit always clean. Her log entry sparse, correct, and dated. She'd answer a direct question, sign a requisition, eat with her section, and then go back to that chair like it was the only place on the firebase that had any weight to it. I didn't know her tasking. She had a classification I didn't have clearance for. Nobody told me that part. What I received when I took command of Keller was a roster with her name, a general notation that she was on long-cycle observation assignment, and a single line from the outgoing rangemaster that said, "Leave the post allocation alone." I didn't know what that meant. The outgoing rangemaster was gone before I could ask. What I knew was what I could see. A corporal in an observation post chair, watching a supply road for 7 months, and not once had she called in a contact. Not once had she fired a weapon on my firebase. Not once had she handed me anything that looked like a result. I ran a working post. I had an incoming rotation of forward observers from Colonel Rask's element, who needed observation hours, and a chair that a corporal was keeping warm, without, as far as I could tell, doing anything useful with it. She never complained, never pushed back against the requisition limits or the generator noise or the rotation changes that shuffled her section twice in 4 months. She adapted, without drama, which I took as confirmation that she wasn't doing anything critical enough to be disrupted by the changes. That was its own kind of logic. I know that now. So when Rask came through on his quarterly inspection and asked about post-utilization, I told him, "That position's been occupied by the same asset for 7 months," I said. "I'm rotating it into the FO training circuit." I said asset. That was careful of me, I thought. I used the word asset. Rask glanced over at the post. She was there, of course. She was always there. He looked at me. "What's her tasking?" I didn't know. I said I'd check with S2. Rask made a note. Then I went and pulled her out of the chair myself. I didn't yell. I want that on the record. I walked to the post at 0915, and I told her the position was being reassigned, and that I needed her out by 1000 for the incoming rotation. I told her she'd be reassigned to motor pool support, pending a new tasking from S2. She looked at me the way people look at a road sign, briefly, for information, not for comfort, and she said, "Understood, Master Sergeant." That was it. No argument, no pushback. She packed her kit with the same economy she did everything else, and she was out of the post by 0940. PFC Tanner was in the chair by 10:15, fresh from Rask's FO element, binoculars around his neck, notebook open, doing everything right. I felt like I'd fixed something. That is what I remember most clearly about that morning. The sense that I had corrected an inefficiency, an asset in the wrong place, reassigned to a useful function, the fire base running cleaner. Rask had seen me take action, which always matters on an inspection. I walked back to the duty desk with the particular satisfaction of a man who has solved a problem that had been sitting in his peripheral vision for months. I didn't sleep well that night. But I told myself that was the generator. Route Breckman had been hit 11 times in the 14 months before I arrived at Keller. IEDs, primarily, command wire devices placed in the culverts on the eastern approach. Twice the low culvert by the mill track, 3 times at the drainage bridge near kilometer 4. The triggerman had survived 2 clearance operations. S2 had a file on him that was, as I later learned, considerably more detailed than the summary version I'd seen. He had a methodology. He moved at low traffic hours. He used the same 3 approach windows. And he had apparently decided that a fire base that had changed range masters twice in 8 months, and kept its attention pointed toward the mountain sector, wasn't watching his road anymore. He wasn't entirely wrong about that. He was wrong about one thing. He appeared on Route Breckman the morning after I reassigned the chair. 0623. The light was thin, the valley still in its first hour of visibility, the dust on the road holding the nights cool. Tanner was in the post. Tanner had 12 hours of observation time, a fresh logbook, and genuinely good eyes. He saw the man on the road. He logged a standard local national movement, adult male, north to south, non-threatening posture, no visible load. What Tanner did not know, because no one had briefed him, the triggerman always walked north to south on approach days. He used the uphill direction to carry the wire spool under his coat, slung on the left shoulder, because the uphill lean masked the weight shift. From the OP aperture at that distance, the spool created a subtle forward tilt on the left side that was only visible when the man paused to check for vehicle traffic, a pause he made, twice on any given approach, always at the same 2 reference points on the road. You would only know to look for it if you had been looking at the same stretch of road, at those exact reference points, for 7 months. Tanner logged a non-threatening adult male. The call never came. I was at the duty desk at 0710 when SSGT. Rourke came in from the motor pool. His face had an expression I didn't have a category for yet. "Corporal Voss isn't on her vehicle check," he said. I asked where she was. He didn't know. Her check sheet was on the hood of the second vehicle, laid flat and weighed down with her pen, like she'd set both things down and walked away for a moment to deal with something, and would be back shortly. She was not back shortly. I had the post called. Tanner confirmed she hadn't come through. I checked the equipment shed and the south perimeter latrine block. Rourke checked the generator housing and the north supply bay. I stood in the motor pool for a moment with the pen in my hand. Her pen, the ballpoint she'd set down on that check sheet, like she was coming right back. And I thought about the outgoing range master's single line of instruction, leave the post allocation alone. I had not left the post allocation alone. I had reassigned the chair for the sake of a quarterly inspection. And the comfort of having something visible to show a colonel. I was 2 minutes into deciding how I felt about running a formal missing persons check on a corporal who had been on post 12 hours ago without incident when the shot came. A single report, sharp, high, directional, coming from the southeast ridge above the firebase, from the long slope that ran back toward the drainage line and the old observation route nobody used anymore, because the path had washed out too, winters back, 1 round. And then the particular quiet that follows a rifle at distance, the kind that isn't actually silence but the absence of the expected second shot. The valley holding still to see if there's more. There wasn't more. My radio crackled. The S2 watch officer at Fob Aldrin, 12 kilometers east, voice controlled and careful in the way that means the information is already confirmed and he's making sure you hear it correctly. "Keller, this is Aldrin S2. Be advised, route Breckman South approach, single contact, adult male down. Positive identification on the triggerman from Operation Clearwater. Over." I held the handset. The duty post was quiet. One of the junior privates at the map board had turned around to look at me, and I watched him decide not to say anything. Colonel Rask had been on the inspection route near the motor pool. He had heard the shot. He'd stepped out of the inspection area and was standing in the open when the radio call came through on the external feed. His face, when he turned toward the duty post, was doing the same arithmetic mine was, and coming up with the same answer neither of us wanted to say out loud. She came down off the southeast ridge 22 minutes later. No haste in her pace. Rifle slung, barrel down, the way you carry a weapon when the work is finished and you're not expecting more. She walked straight to the motor pool, picked up her pen from the hood of the second vehicle, and went back to logging the check like she'd stepped away for a glass of water. Rask walked over to the motor pool alone. I watched it from the duty post. He stood about 6 feet from her. She kept writing. He waited long enough that I thought he might say something. A word, a question, anything. And then he came to attention and rendered a full formal salute and held it. She returned it without looking up from the clipboard. He held it 1 more second. Then he dropped it, turned and walked back toward the inspection route without looking at me. That was all. I pulled her classification file 3 days later. I had to go through the S2 watch officer and a second-level clearance I apparently had on paper but had never exercised. And it took most of a morning and a phone call to a number I'd never dialed before to get the file in my hands. I sat with it at the duty desk in the late afternoon, after the post change and the generator check and the vehicle log, and I read it in the quiet. 7-month solo overwatch assignment, Route Breckman, counter ID and counter sniper tasking, Operation Clearwater supplemental, designated marksman certification, advanced, 2 prior deployments, 1 confirmed long-range elimination in a separate theater at 1,180 meters. Classified. Her instructions. Observe Root Breckman daily, build a complete pattern of life file on the triggerman, and take the shot when conditions and positive identification align simultaneously. Firing authority at her own discretion within the tasking parameters. No spotter required by protocol. No prior notification to Firebase Rangemaster. The tasking classification sat above my clearance level and was not to be disclosed to post administrators unless the post commander held a supplemental clearance, which I did not. The shot she'd made that morning was 1,340 meters. Cold bore, 11 km/h crosswind from the northwest. From the southeast ridge, which she had not occupied in 22 hours. The file noted that she had spent 4 months pre-calculating the shot from 3 potential positions, accounting for seasonal temperature shift, the daily wind pattern off the drainage, and the specific pause points the triggerman used on his approach. I read the file twice. I sat with it for a while after the second reading. At the bottom of the second page was a handwritten annotation from the S2 officer who had cut the original tasking order. It read, Post Rangemaster is not to be briefed. Classification necessity. Asset works best without interference from post administration. I had been the 3rd Rangemaster she'd worked under at Keller. Both prior Rangemasters had apparently followed the outgoing instruction I'd received and simply left the post allocation alone. I was the one who hadn't. When I finally set it down and looked over at Observation Post Keller, the eastern aperture was dark. Post change had happened an hour earlier. The chair was empty. I told Rourke the next morning that the chair Voss had used was not to be entered as general inventory. If it wore out, it was to be replaced in kind, not pooled, not redistributed, replaced in kind and returned to that position. Rourke looked at me. I didn't explain. He didn't ask twice. Voss rotated out of Keller 11 days later, at the close of Operation Clearwater. She shook hands with her section chief, checked her gear out of stores, and was on the morning transport before the firebase had fully come awake. She left no note. There was no ceremony, no particular last moment I can tell you about. Just the absence of her in that chair, and Root Breckman running clean, and the silence from that road, holding for the remaining 4 months I spent at Keller. When the firebase was decommissioned, I had the chair loaded with my personal equipment. It's in my office now. People who don't know ask about it sometimes. I tell them it belonged to someone who was better at her job than I was at mine. Most of them smile when I say that, the way people smile when they assume you're being modest. I'm not being modest. I made a mistake in front of 12 people. 11 of them stayed quiet and 1 laughed, and the chair is there, so that I remember every day what the mistake looked like, and who paid the cost of it before I could be corrected. She never said a word about it. That was the worst part, and also, I have come to understand, the most accurate measure of how little my opinion had ever mattered to the work.